Okay, guys, I'm here today to talk about the Boston Bruins and whether or not I still think they're a Stanley Cup contender. As we know, they've made some moves this offseason. They've moved on from a couple of key players, and we're going to look at their roster too, just a brief look into it to see, if this roster is good enough to compete for a Stanley Cup still. We all know the Bruins have had lots of cup aspirations these past number of years. And yeah, well, let's get into it, guys. Let's see if the Boston Bruins are still Stanley Cup contenders. Okay, so the key guys that they moved on from were two defensemen on the back end. One was 5'9" and one was 6'9". The 5'9" one was Torrey Krug, obviously, as we all know. He moved on in free agency and signed with the St. Louis Blues. The other one, the 6'9" one, was Zdeno Chara. He moved on and signed with the Washington Capitals. I think much to everyone's surprise, Chara coming out and saying, of course, that he wanted a bigger role and Boston wasn't willing to give him that, as they want to kind of hand the reins over to the kids now. And I don't really mind that move by the Boston Bruins, to be honest with you. I think it is kind of maybe a time for a bit of a changing of the guard. They still have a good core. That core is getting older. Now that they've moved Chara out of that core, though, maybe you can, add a guy like McAvoy into that core. Maybe even a Brandon Carlo. These are guys that I think are going to be very key for the Boston Bruins going forward if they want to have any success. Now, with them missing Torrey Krug, obviously they lose offense. Some offense there for sure. Krug's a guy who was a great power play quarterback for them. He had good 5-on-5 offensive numbers too. On the defensive side of the puck, I know Bruins fans were a little, they could get on him a little bit for that. His defense wasn't always up to par, but he was more known to be an offensive defenseman. But with Chara, his defensive game, on the other hand, was very good. Boston's going to miss him on the penalty kill. They're going to miss him in those key situations. I know he was 43 years old, and maybe it kind of was time to move on, but I still think the Bruins could have got another good year out of him, in my opinion. And now let's look at this roster, and let's see if this roster is good enough to compete for a Stanley Cup, because for the Bruins, even though they're in a very tough division this year, I definitely don't think they're going to be as dominant as they were last regular season, especially in this division. If it was in the Atlantic division, I'd probably give them maybe finishing second or something like that. But in this division, they could even get in as a wild card. Who knows? It's a very tough division. You got a lot of good teams. Washington is always going to. Chara's going to face his old team 7 or 8 times this year probably. Washington's always competitive, like I said. Philadelphia is looking like they're on the upswing. Pittsburgh, I think, still has some playoff life left in them. The Rangers are up and coming. The Islanders are always hard to play against with that defensive style they play. I think the only two teams that maybe are kind of not going to be competitive in that division this year, just because it is really hard, is probably the Buffalo Sabres and the New Jersey Devils. Those are two teams I don't really see having a lot of vim and vigor as far as points go, and being that competitive in that really tough division that they're going to be in this year. So for the Boston Bruins, I think their first line, now these are just, before we get started, I just want to say that these lines are just kind of a rough estimate of what I think they might look like. I could be wrong, but I think this one I'm probably going to be right on. If these two guys are healthy to start the season, that is. Marchand, Bergeron, Pasternak, that line's going to be, outstanding probably as always. Bergeron is getting older. I believe he's 35 now, so he's no spring chicken anymore. Marchand's not getting any younger. Pasternak's still a young guy. He's got lots of good years left in him. But I think for this season alone anyways, that line should still be on fire for the Bruins. Next up, we got Jake DeBrusk, David Krejci, and Craig Smith. I really like the addition of the Bruins bringing in Craig Smith. He's a guy that can score. He can play top six. He's definitely not a first-line player, but I think he's a guy who, he can fit into that second line, maybe even third line role. I'd probably like to see him more on the third line, but if with him on your second line, I can't really complain about that either. I think it's still a great option for the Boston Bruins. Third line, I think, is going to be a pretty interesting one. Anders Bjork, Charlie Coyle, and Andre Kasha. Bjork and Kasha had some speed. Coyle's got lots of size. He's got good passing ability. He is an underrated player, in my opinion. He had that great playoffs a couple seasons ago now when the Boston Bruins went all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals. He's a player that maybe at times leaves you wanting a little bit more, Charlie Coyle does, but I think if he can play up to his potential this year, the Boston Bruins should be okay. Fourth line, Ritchie, Corelli, Wagner. That's a very physical, pesky group. They get on you in a hurry. They're fast too. Not only are they physical, but especially Corelli and Wagner anyways. They're pretty fast skaters. Corelli's a very effective penalty killer. Wagner kills penalties too sometimes. So those are guys that are all going to be pretty effective for the Boston Bruins. Their forward group looks all right to me. But then you go on the back ends where it's really going to look different. And you're going to see some new faces probably this year taking on bigger roles anyways. McAvoy, Carlo, first pairing. I got John Moore, Matt Grzelcyk as the second pairing, Connor Clifton, Jeremy Lauzon as the third pairing. In net, I got Tuukka Rask, Yaroslav Halak, maybe Dan Vlader, maybe Swayman gets in for Boston too, Jeremy Swayman. Maybe he gets in some games, who knows. But the interesting thing is Halak and Rask are both unrestricted free agents at the end of this season, and if those two guys, or even one of them, especially if Rask decides to go, there's been a lot of talk. I want to get this out of the way. Okay, it's probably the elephant in the room. There's been a lot of talk that Tuukka Rask is going to retire, and I know that whole situation with him leaving the bubble, and Bruins fans were so upset at him. I mean, that's a different topic for another day, and I think it's unfortunate considering his daughter, I think, had health issues, so he left the bubble, and I mean, good on him. I have to support a player when he puts family first, because that's ultimately most important than winning or losing hockey games. But all that aside, there's been a lot of talk that maybe Rask doesn't love the game. He's not a true Boston Bruin, doesn't have enough intensity at times. Tuukka Rask has been really darn good for the Boston Bruins. And as an Ottawa Senators fan, I can tell you that good goaltending means a lot, because my team has not had that for a long time. And you people in Boston better be grateful that Tuukka Rask has been pretty darn good. And yeah, he's had some, people always remember the bad moments, his mishaps in Game 7, his mishaps in Game 6 against the Chicago Blackhawks in 2013. But all in all, I mean, he's done way more good in net than bad for the Boston Bruins. And now I just want to circle back on the defense before I get to some of the youngsters that could potentially take spots for the Bruins too this year. Charlie McAvoy, Brandon Carlo, if that's to be the pairing, that's a very solid pairing. Yeah, they're missing Torrey Krug, and that hurts. But their defense isn't going to be as good as in years past, their group of 6. But with the way the Boston Bruins play defense, Bruce Cassidy's a really good coach. He's got those guys playing a certain way that they can miss some good players in their lives. The Bruins seem to deal with tons of injuries every year, and they're still able to get through and be one of the better teams in the league because of the way they play defense. And most years they do get good goaltending. And with the system that they play, I think they can overcome the loss of Zdeno Chara and even Torrey Krug. And I think McAvoy's got even more to give. He's only going to get better. Carlo's a good defensive defenseman. Second pairing, John Moore, Matt Grzelcyk. I think Grzelcyk's got some good wheels on him too. He can really skate. He's got more offensive upside too than people think. John Moore, I mean, he's kind of hit his ceiling. He's an older guy. I think he's a serviceable player. He's not a super great player, but he's serviceable enough. He's not dead weight or anything like that. Connor Clifton, Jeremy Lauzon. I mean, Lauzon's got to probably start getting his act together. He's a guy that the Bruins probably have relied upon to be the next wave of players, so to speak, in Boston. Clifton, I think, has some offensive upside, but he is probably more of a third pairing guy. Now let's get to some of these extras here. I got Anton Bleed, Greg McKegg, Parlin home, Trent Frederick, Jack Stugnica, Carson Kuhlman at forward. On the back end, I got Jakub Zaboral, Steven Kampfer, Victor Berglund, and Kevin Miller, and Eero Vakanainen too. So it's interesting to me that they brought Miller back. The guy didn't play at all last season. I personally thought his career was done, or if anything, he'd get a pro tryout somewhere. But no, the Boston Bruins brought him back, so they must see something in him. Now, there are going to have to be some guys probably at forward also that take the reins. Now, that first line, like I said, is going to be really good. But what about the lines after that? I see, okay, Marchand, Pasternak, Bergeron are going to be themselves, I would expect anyways. DeBrusk, at times he's a good player, but at times I think he leaves more to be desired. And I know Bruins fans have been unhappy with him at times. I personally wouldn't trade him yet. I think it's way too early to give up on a player like him. Krejci's not getting any younger. He deals with a lot of injury issues. It's hard to bank on him playing a full season, being healthy for a full season. Craig Smith, I think, is a guy that can get you 20 goals. I don't really think he's more than that. To be honest, he's definitely not going to be a 30-goal guy. Bjork's got to get his act together. He has to be better. He's one of the guys Boston, again, has relied on to be that next wave after their core, of older guys maybe isn't as good anymore, but you get that next wave of a guy like Anders Bjork that can be better. And they're going to need some offense coming in. A guy like Jack Studnicka is one that really stands out to me. He's a guy that had a tremendous year in the AHL for Providence last year. He's going to have to learn the game in the NHL level. Obviously, it's a lot different than the AHL level. But with that being said, I think he has the tools to do it. He's another good centerman for Boston. He's got lots of offensive upside. He's a guy that could really help them, especially if Marchand or Pasternak, who are both injured right now, I might add, aren't able to start the season, and Studnicka can come in and make a case for himself. I mean, what an opportunity that would be. Maybe this is where he gets his foot in the door to be a full-time NHLer this season. The Boston Bruins sure hope so, that's for sure. Another guy, Trent Frederick, he's had a taste of NHL games before. He's a guy that he's not as good as Studnicka, I don't think, but he's a good enough skater. I think he's a player that's going to be good for the Bruins. He's a prospect that, he might not be as good as people think, but I don't think he's going to be a disappointment either. Carson Kuhlman, I think he's got lots of speed. Probably not the offensive upside as some of those other guys I just mentioned, some of those other prospects, but he's a guy who has some good upside. And on the back end, I mean, Vakanainen sounds like he's going to be a good puck mover as well. Jakub Zaboral, I mean, this guy is obviously a pretty big disappointment. As we know, the Bruins infamously had those 3 first-round picks back to back, and only one of them they really, truly hit on, and that was Jake DeBrusk. And I mean, when you look at this roster now, that maybe could suffer a bit of lacking of secondary scoring this season, potentially. Yeah, I mean, Matt Barzal would look really good in there right now. Kyle Connor, Brock Besser, even a Thomas Chabot on the back end. So, I mean, who knows? I don't want to rub any salt in the wounds, Bruins fans. I'm not trying to do that. I'm just saying the obvious. Of course, we know those guys would look good on any team. And this is the first time in a few years I think we can say that the Boston Bruins have a little bit of question marks as far as their roster goes. I think in years past, at least from the 17-18 season onward, we kind of knew who was going to be on their roster for the most part. This is probably the most question marks they've had since I would say maybe the 15-16 or 16-17 season, when the Bruins went through that stretch of mediocrity for 2 or 3 years. And of course, we know they rose back up quickly to the top as one of the premier teams once again in this league. And me personally, I think as far as being a cup contender goes, let me just put it this way. I don't think they're going to be nowhere near as good as they were last season, just because also not only they've lost some guys, but it's not even so much that, just because they're in such a tough division this year. I think they could maybe potentially finish 3rd or 4th in that division. I don't really know if they're going to be top 2. I wouldn't look. I can't really count the Bruins out too much, because every time people have counted them out, they always find a way to be a good team. Like I said, they're really well coached too. So even with the loss of some of these guys, they don't have to blow the doors off you offensively either. The Bruins are a team that they just seem very comfortable winning games 1-0, 2-1, 3-2, stuff like that, just because of the fact that they play so well defensively. They do still have a lot of good veterans on that team, despite wanting to get younger, that have been there before. They know how to play in those situations, and they're very comfortable doing it. So for that reason, I for sure would not count them out of the playoffs. And I don't think they're as much of a surefire contender, but I think they definitely have to be a dark horse contender at the very least to win the Stanley Cup. I mean, like I said, with the way they're coached, they still have some very darn good players on this team that could play. really well for them next year or this season. And even if these youngsters come in and play really well too, and they get good goaltending from Rask as expected, I mean, this should be a team that will still be very dangerous in the playoffs as well. But guys, that's what I think on this topic. If you're a Bruins fan especially, I would like to hear from you in the comments down below. But from any fan, I want to hear what you think. Are the Boston Bruins done being Stanley Cup contenders? Or do they still have another run or two left in them? I personally think they have at least another run left in them. It's hard to say beyond this year just because they do have so many question marks as far as contracts go. Obviously, if Rask leaves, that really changes the equation in net for them. But I'd like to hear what you guys have to say. Please like and subscribe and share this video, and I'll talk to you guys again soon.